I, by profession, am a carver. That is to say, I practice the art of subtraction, the art of making something by taking something away, the art of beginning with a block of wood and removing what shouldn't be there and ending up with something like this. This kind of high-relief, illusionistic wood carving was invented just over 300 years ago by the wonderfully named Grinling Gibbons, the greatest British wood carver and the greatest of all decorative wood carvers. I'll give you an example of his work. This is an example of his work. It's from a church in London on Piccadilly. The date is 1686. Gibbons was particularly admired in his time and since then for his wonderfully delicate and lifelike flowers. I myself like to do botanical forms, but I find that more and more these years I'm doing human artifacts in my carvings. Like, for example, this musical trophy, which I did for a patron of the musical arts in New York City. That's Benny Goodman's clarinet there. This guy was a great friend of Benny Goodman, and actually Benny Goodman's clarinet is in the Metropolitan Museum, so I was able to copy it. I also have taken to heart Ezra Pound's advice to artists, which is make it new. So even though I often use old-fashioned forms, this, for example, is called a letter rack. I like to include in them contemporary technological gadgetry, like, for example, iPhones and iPods. The idea is to bring the carving up to date, but you know something, it backfires terribly, because within weeks of my doing this carving, which has an iPhone 4 in it, I don't need to complete it. Now we have an iPhone 6. So in trying to bring it up to date, I've succeeded in dating it. I don't know whether that's funny or pathetic, but actually I quite like it. It's sort of like, it tells you something about art. Art is short, but life is long. Or actually, I think it goes the other way, doesn't it? Well, never mind. So that's a kind of brief sample of the kind of work I do. I think it could be said that carvers' lives are pretty quiet. But some years ago, I had what I would call now, with the advantage of hindsight, an adventure that brought me face to face with my long-dead master, Grinling Gibbons, under conditions which were challenging, to say the least. We'll get to that, but let me first talk about this adventure, which, like all good adventures, taught me something about the world as we went along. And what it taught me about the world is the way creativity works in the world. Now, I know creativity is an overused word, and it probably flies around too much at conferences like this. But nonetheless, have we really thought hard enough about the different forms that creativity can take in the world? I, for one, like most people, had always thought of creativity, I'd always associated it with the eureka moment, when, for example, the solution suddenly jumps out of the computer, or the poem dawns on the poet, or the melody comes to the songwriter, or some daydreaming geek gets the idea that it would be cool if you could access the internet using some device you could carry in your pocket. Or I'll give you another example. I once was friends with probably the brightest young star in the mathematics department at Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge. This guy led a peculiar life. Although he was meant to be doing his doctoral dissertation, in fact, as far as I could see, he spent most of his time down at the pub playing darts. Or if he wasn't doing that, he was sitting in his room reading cheap detective stories. This went on for months, for years. And then one day I met him on the street, and we talked along for a while, and he said, "Oh, guess what? I did my dissertation last night." And I said, "What do you mean you did your dissertation last night? how long is it? He said, 3.5 pages. This was very upsetting to me. I was on about page 200 of my dissertation, which was in English literature, and the end was nowhere in sight. So I stared at him, and he said, yeah, I was down at the pub last night playing darts. What a surprise, I thought. And then suddenly, between the time that I picked up the dart and I brought it back to throw it, the whole thing came to me in perfect clarity. So I put down my dart, finished up my pint, went home and wrote it up. Wrote out all the equations, and that's the end of it. Then he asked me if I wanted to go down to the pub and play darts with him, of course. We all love stories like this. They're exhilarating. The moment when the apple drops on Newton's head, and at that moment, modern physics is born. Let's call this type 1 creativity, the kind of creativity that creates great ideas, grand visions, inspiring plans, the kind of creativity, and maybe that's indeed what creativity actually is, this capacity to create ideas or visions. And yet, there's a painter called Chuck Close who said something which should give us all pause. He said, inspiration is for amateurs. Inspiration is for amateurs. I would argue that there's a second type of creativity which comes into play when we try to actualize these ideas in the world. Let's call this type 2 creativity, sort of late onset, kind of like type 2 diabetes, if you forgive not a very good analogy. The thunderbolt moment may be enough in the pure sciences or in pure research, but it's type 2 creativity, which is embroiled in process, in the process of making, in the process of making something of an idea, which I think changes the world. Let me tell you why I came to think along these lines myself, and now we get to the adventure part. This is a picture of Hampton Court Palace, a royal palace on the Thames about 10 miles upstream from London. Most of the palace was built in the early 16th century. It goes back to the time of Henry VIII. But you'll see in the top right corner a large rectangular, more classical building. This was built by Sir Christopher Wren for William III in about 1698. And I knew this building well because it holds some of Gibbons's finest carvings. And it was a site of the catastrophe that happened in the late 1980s. A fire started in the top floor and eventually burnt down through into the great king's apartments, which lie below, where Gibbons's carvings hang. I saw pictures, I was in this country at this point, and I saw pictures like this. And I assumed that Gibbons's carvings had been lost completely. But it transpired that miraculously enough, only one carving had been completely destroyed. And that was a drop or a pendant next to a painting above a door, sort of 7 feet long. And to make a long story short, and I've written about this, so I won't try to summarize it here, I was eventually commissioned to replace this carving with as much accuracy as possible, with holographic accuracy if I could. There are a few problems with this commission. The first was that I had never done any kind of period reproduction work, still less reproduction work of a Grinling Gibbons carving, and still less reproduction of a Grinling Gibbons carving that no longer existed. The only documentation we had of it was this unpromising 1939, a glass plate photograph, poorly lit, taken under emergency circumstances in 1939 as the German bombers circled overhead. The other problem, it takes what must have been a beautiful carving and turns it into something that looks like a spilled bit of oatmeal porridge. The other problem was that it was widely thought that Grinling Gibbons' carving techniques and his method of construction to produce these extraordinarily high relief carvings had been lost in the mists of history. In fact, Gibbons' best scholar said, frankly, the secret to Gibbons' carvings has been lost, and there's no point in trying to recover it. But it was hard to resist a gauntlet like that. So I set out. What I did first was try to recover every iota of information I could from this photograph and turn it into a drawing, into a design drawing, which I did. That design drawing looked a little like a European map of Africa in the 19th century. The outline was pretty clear, but the inside was full of empty terra incognita spaces. But nonetheless, I transferred the design to the carving and set out to work. You can see how long ago this was. Look at that hair. And it was here in this paneled chamber at the palace, which was turned into a workroom, that I ground to a halt one day 4 months later. The fact is that as I feared, the information that my design and the photographs gave to me simply was not sufficient to show me the way forward. My type 1 creativity came to a halt. The idea, the plan could only get me so far, and then I felt as one does when one's ideas or plans hit the world and founder. I felt, looking down at my half-completed carving, that I was adrift on a sea of chaotic, incomplete forms with no compass to show me forward. And then something very odd happened. I looked down at this half-completed carving, and it looked like one of my own carvings at just that stage of completion, any one of my carvings at that stage of completion. And then something even odder happened. It was as if Grinling Gibbons time traveled forward from 1698, glided into the room, and I saw the carving with his ghostly eyes, and I heard him speaking in my ear. And what he said was, don't be a fool. Don't be the slave to your design. Do what you would do at this stage of completion of your carving. Do what I did with this carving when I reached that stage. And I realized that, in fact, the carving had reached that fulcrum point in its development. In any carving project, and I think in any project, maybe I think of any project you've been involved in, there comes a turning point in the middle of the carving, in the middle of the project, when instead of looking at the design, which you have pinned up next to you, you start looking at the carving itself. You start taking your cues from the carving. The carving tells you what to do. What this means is that type 2 creativity takes over. Type 2 creativity, which is embroiled in process, which can recognize potentialities in half-formed things and nurse them towards completion. Type 2 creativity, which guides you forward through this chaotic sea, which takes over when ideas give out. So I found the way forward. I'd like to drill down one level lower with this idea. This is a carving tool, carving chisel. It's about as simple as a tool gets. Very basic hardware here. You don't have to plug it in. You don't have to recharge the battery. You don't have to update the software. It doesn't even have an operating system. Well, you're looking at the operating system. And it also boots up really very quickly. ready to go. But this carving chisel, I'm showing this one, but I have 130 on my bench. This carving chisel, like all tools, is a device for actualizing your ideas in the world, for giving your ideas physical form. In that sense, it's a type 1 device. It's driven by ideas, but it actually operates in a type 2 creative universe. What that means is that most carvers find out very quickly that if you try to brutally impose your ideas on the wood, on the world, then the wood and the world rebel furiously. Wood has a resistant grain to it. The world has a resistant grain to it. If you're a carver, you've got to constantly change the angle and the pressure of your blade in the wood in order to manage it. Wood has to be wooed. The world has to be wooed. And you do it, first of all, by learning about the world, learning about the wood. And this turns out to be, this carving tool with this viciously sharp edge, turns out to be a sensing device just as much as it is a shaping device. What happens is, when you carve, you use two hands. You can do it either this way or that way. Carvers are ambidextrous. One hand is the propulsive hand. One hand is the hand that's trying to impose the idea on the world. The other hand is the restraining hand, and it's always anchored on the wood in one way or other. And it, as it were, it represents the wood. It resists the propulsive hand with just the same resistance that the wood itself does. And it's this dynamic tension between your two hands, between your two arms, that gives you not only the control over the blade, but it makes it into an exquisite sensing device. What you really are doing, to drill it down even further, is you're integrating, you're internalizing the wood, the world, into your own nerves and muscles. And so when you administer the wood, it's like an internal administration. You know, type 2 creativity flips the idea of the solitary visionary in his room. Instead, you're out in the world. You're collaborating with the world. You're negotiating with the world. You're being opportunistically negotiating with the world. If you're a carver, you're collaborating with the wood. If you're other people, you're collaborating with the forces in the worlds in which you move, the social or the political or the economic world. So this very basic, archaic, humble device actually incorporates in it, in a sort of dynamic tension, both type 1 and type 2 creativity, the kind of creativity that exists among ideas and the kind of creativity that grows out of action. And this is, many months later, the carving that resulted, posed for its photo op on the garden wall outside of Hampton Court. So finally, it would be easier if all we had to do was wait for the thunderbolt to strike and then put our dart down and go home and write it up. But if your ideas have a target in the world, then you're going to want to throw that dart, and you're going to want to manage its trajectory using a kind of creativity which is not unworldly, but worldly. The kind of creativity that takes root in that jumble of unfinished work you see on your desk every morning. Aristotle said, "The eye cannot see the sun unless it first becomes sun-like. We cannot change the world unless we make it a part of us, unless we're a part of the world." If you're a carver of botanical forms, this is what you have to become when you ply your chisels. I give you this image half in jest, but only half in jest. Thank you.